subscription fees, right? So continue reading your article, $50 off. This is definitely capitalism. Here's how I think the situation has changed. The situation has changed since the introduction of the internet and the web. Basically, before the web, you needed gatekeepers to approve your message, to get on TV, to get on the radio, to be published in a magazine or an op-ed in a newspaper. After the web, anybody could write some code and just deploy a website, and anyone in the world could read it. So geographic boundaries got smashed, and also permissionless publishing came out. So that really radically changed the way that our society is able to have multiple voices now. But it also disrupted journalism because journalism had to adapt. And so journalism, at least the way that we have it, is essentially a for-profit enterprise. It's run by for-profit companies. And I want to share my screen and kind of show you what that looks like today on the web, because they've essentially resorted to two different things. The first thing is they charge you for subscription fees, right? So continue reading your article, $50 off. This is definitely capitalism, right? It's a top-down company, the Wall Street Journal. They tell the reporters what to do. They have editors, they control what gets published, but they have to keep the lights on and they have to pay. So they're subject to the market competition. And as a result, I don't think they can print stories that are essentially lukewarm. A lot of organizations now, news organizations, have been pushed to print stories that are sensational and only tell one side of the story. They may say, look what Trump did, or look what Biden did. How could they? And then outrage happens and the story gets shared and shared and shared. So do you think that capitalism and the profit motive and market competition shapes the way that these stories have become one-dimensional or only tell one side? Because if they started to defect, and if Fox News decided suddenly to say the liberals are not so bad, then they would lose their audience. What do you think about that?
I think it's exactly what's been going on for over a century. So if you go back to the earlier period, say the founding of the country, there was a very different conception of freedom of speech. The founding fathers, if you look at the Constitution, it has in it not just the First Amendment, it also establishes the post office. That had a lot to do with freedom of speech. The post office was designed as a way for the government to promote diversity of the press. About 80% of post office business in the early years was essentially virtually free circulation of journals, subsidized. It was a form of government subsidy to journals to promote diversity of opinion, because their idea was they were in favor of positive freedom, not just negative freedom, the capitalist story. They thought the government should actively be involved in promoting a diverse, free press. That's what the post office was primarily for. One of the reasons the right wing wants to kill the post office is that it still, to some limited extent, has that function.
Well, one thing I wanted to bring up is the right wing and the left wing wanting to.
Okay.
Sorry, for the interest of time, I just wanted to ask sort of several questions.
Let me just say that what you described about the Wall Street Journal has been true of journals from their inception. Before the internet, you had to pay to subscribe to a journal. Now, actually, the subscriptions to a journal don't pay for it. What pays for the journal is the advertising.
The advertising. And I want to get to that next. That's in your book as well.
It goes back a century, back to the late 19th century. There was a shift to capital concentration of newspapers, and meaning more monopolization and advertiser reliance. That had a major effect in undermining the diversity of the press. There were many journals that just couldn't survive the effect of advertiser concentration on the centrist to right journals. There was a much more diverse press before. In England, for example, even as late as the 1960s, the most read newspaper was the Daily Herald, which was social democratic. The tabloids, like the Mirror, were social democratic. That couldn't withstand capital concentration and advertiser reliance.
Right. But I think
earlier.
Right now, I wanted to bring things into the current world because the last 20 years, last 10 years, because we have a phenomenon of not just the newspapers being driven by the profit motive and having to pay journalists, but also we have Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and other privately owned companies that were started by founders like Mark Zuckerberg, for example, or Reid Hoffman for LinkedIn, Evan Williams for Twitter, and so on. They still call the shots at these companies. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg, the shareholders sometimes have a vote to vote him out or overrule him, but he has most of the voting shares. And so it's a futile gesture. And so in capitalism, each share gives you one vote. And in a democracy, each person gets one vote, regardless of how many shares they have. My question to you is, what do you think is wrong with having our public discourse, our conversations in the public forums on privately owned giant platforms that the government, is trying to now considering breaking up and are even putting bills in place to talk about breaking them up?
That is a new factor. The other things we've been talking about go way back, but this is new. There's now a situation where a very small number of private corporations basically control what amounts to a public utility. The information system is to a substantial extent in the hands of Facebook, Google, a couple of others, and they do what they want. There isn't even a pretense of democracy. But what you said about shareholders is right. It doesn't, one person has 1 million shares, another has 1 share. That's not democracy.
So then my question is, it seems that we have 2 ways out of this. One way is to use big state governments in order to break up these companies and force them to have competition. Then you have pretty much still very large companies, but at least you have a choice. My other question, though, is what do you think about the open source movement? I'm talking about, like, for example, WordPress. You know about WordPress, right? It was funded by the New York Times and a few other companies. WordPress now powers 40% of all websites in the world. They use it to make blogs. They use it to publish. It's open source. Anybody can use it. Similarly, Linux runs on many computers and so on. There's no profit motive. And I mentioned last time Wikipedia. In Wikipedia, the articles are collaboratively edited. And in Linux, the software is collaboratively built. So there are no heroes. There are no intrepid journalists. There are no celebrities. It's just the content. And by the time it reaches the people, it's already had 20 different editors from different sides fix up certain things. So it's not a one-sided narrative. Do you think something like that, without a profit motive and collaboratively produced, could be superior to what is essentially privately owned newspapers and privately owned sources of information?
Well, first of all, we should remember that these are not sources of information. They don't have reporters in the field. They don't have news bureaus in Karachi. Okay, we're getting the information from the same sources, from the mainstream media. That's where the information is generated. These systems, Facebook and the rest, have a filtering effect. They impose their own further filters on what gets to people. They do permit expression of opinion. And that's, the internet does allow expression of opinion. It also, but these companies that basically control, it turns out they are what people look at. The internet allows you to, in principle, to read the press in Lebanon, the Daily Star in Lebanon, which is in English. It allows you to read a Pakistani newspaper, Dawn, which has an English edition. But people don't do it. What they do is go to their favorite Facebook bubble. So the effect is that a few companies are basically controlling the information flow, and that shouldn't be permitted. And then the question is, how do we deal with it? Well, a couple of methods. One is what you described, alternative systems. It's fine if that can break through.
Open source, Wikipedia, that sort of collaborative effort?
It has its own problems. Wikipedia is great if you're looking up something in the Riemann hypothesis in mathematics or medieval history. If you're looking at anything contemporary and contentious, Wikipedia is a very dubious source.
Well, so that's the core of what I wanted to ask you about. You have a collaborative system where people can come and say, hey, wait a moment, that part of the article needs to be sourced, or that seems to be dishonest and it needs to be fixed. On the other hand, you have something like Fox News or CNN or perhaps Daily Kos or something else, which it cannot go ahead. Fox News can't go ahead and say, progressives are actually great people and their ideas are great, because they're going to lose their audience. So my question is, the incentive structure of the for-profit media, which is what you call the mainstream media, what if there was an open source, collaborative, nonprofit, alternative media? Do you think it could disrupt the mainstream media?
With Fox News, it's not that they'll lose their audience, they'll lose their funding. That's they respond to those who own and fund them, the owners and the advertisers. But they pay some attention to the audience. That's secondary. Yes, it would be very good to have open sources like Wikipedia. We should also be wary of them. In the case of Wikipedia, a small group who are intensely committed to one particular viewpoint can, in fact, take over and control Wikipedia content on particular issues. It doesn't happen on science, ancient history, and so on. There, it's very reliable. But the fact is that when you get to contemporary, contentious issues, you have to be very cautious, because small groups of dedicated people can and do take them over to press their own agenda. But nevertheless, it's good to have. So yes, I'm all in favor of more diverse, open-sourced alternatives. It's also possible that we should do what the founding fathers wanted, have direct government support for diversity of media extending to the internet, with public channels on the internet that are under democratic control to whatever extent democracy exists, and that are available as alternatives to the privately owned systems.
So definitely, I think democratic systems might select for other types of information than privately owned systems. The last thing I wanted to ask you about is the subject of...
Add one sentence to that.
Go ahead.
Just about every country except the United States has major public media. BBC, Deutsche Welle. That's the United States.
But they're hardly unbiased, right? I mean, they're still biased.
They have their own bias, but it's not the bias of corporate control.
It's a different kind of bias, and that's Right. That's what I wanted to ask you about, the most direct relationship between capital and free speech. I think a lot of times in this country, the United States, we have a strong tradition of free speech, but it's hijacked to excuse private ownership of megaphones. For example, Elon Musk has a megaphone. He says something, the Twitter system distributes it instantly to, say, 10 million people, and then another 50 million over the next day. It's unfiltered completely. There is no editing. The SEC has even sometimes suggested maybe they can filter what he says. No, that doesn't go with the freedom of speech. But here's the thing: is it really freedom when the reporters are working for an organization that can fire them if they say something the organization doesn't want? Is it really freedom when you own the means of distribution? Isn't that essentially something else, not human freedom, but rather the organizational control of a message, private ownership of a megaphone? Is that the same thing as freedom of speech, or is it distinct in some way?
So no, this is as old as the hills. Capitalism and democracy are incompatible. They have opposite goals, right? And that shows up in everything. Capitalism is committed to profit for the owners of capital, period. Democracy is committed in principle to governance by the general population. Those are inconsistent.
Although sometimes a democracy devolves into the elites having their own little bubble. And
well, elite is a right-wing term.
Well, for example, I'll give you an example. Congress.
The elites that are effective are the concentrations of capital. Others do exist.
I mean, for example, term limits for Congress people. Most of the public supports it, but Congress will never vote themselves term limits.
Yeah, but that's not the way. If you want to look at the way so-called elites influence democracy, look at the major fact: concentrations of capital. That's what has overwhelming influence.
Well, that's what I'm looking at. Well, and just to be clear, yes,
that's the fundamental conflict between capitalism and democracy.
Yeah, but just to be clear, capitalism, the form of capital can actually be followers, audience. So when Ashton Kutcher, for example, became the first person on Twitter to get 1 million followers, he wasn't a random person. He was someone that the movie industry selected to be an actor. He built up all of those followers who then followed him onto Twitter. And these forms of capital are convertible one into the other. So when you have a lot of followers on Instagram, for example, you can be paid a lot of money to promote certain products or ideas. And the same thing, if you have a lot of money, you can buy a spot and an audience on Twitter or Telegram. So what I'm saying is audience is a form of capital, isn't it? And basically that you yourself have a lot of readers, and in that sense, you are very wealthy in followers, right? So that is a form of capital itself.
No, it's not a form of capital. It's a form of influence. It's not, there's nothing. If people have influence, who cares? That's fine. That's the way the system should work.
A lot of people care.
People have capital that they can use to control and dominate others and to control the acts of government. That's a different story. And that is overwhelmingly the basic concentrations of capital. Those are the ones who buy elections, who influence, who lobby, who write legislation, and so on. There are other things, but this is the major one.
But what about using your influence? Let's say you have a lot of followers. Let's say Elon Musk tweets about Bitcoin and Bitcoin goes down, or he tweets about Dogecoin and Dogecoin goes up. You can move markets if you have a lot of influence. So,
and if you have a lot of billions of dollars, like Elon Musk, but if a person, say Cornel West, has influence, that's fine, but it's not the same as having concentration of capital, which can lobby congressmen, which can buy the election for them, and so on.
So if the Pope, let's say in Rome, who's not a billionaire, if he has a lot of influence, Isn't that a form of capital because he can deploy it to affect different things in the world? Or you don't see those at all similar?
It confuses things to call it capital. It's influence, but it's not capital. It's influence because of a powerful institution with enormous
Hmm.
capital itself and control and obedience by subjects is able to impose influence. Yes.
But that's my point. If Fox News, to take an example which you might disagree with, right? If Fox News is an organization that's built up and it has billionaires founding it, the Australian Rupert Murdoch, and basically, and then he put out Roger Ailes in charge of it. This organization it has a lot of money, and if they choose to put Sean Hannity in a spot, or they choose to put Tucker Carlson to take Bill O'Reilly's position, doesn't that have a giant influence on what millions of people will think? What I'm saying is it's interchangeable. That what people think is influenced by money, but also money is influenced by having a giant audience. They're convertible forms of capital in a sense.
I don't see any advantage to mixing up very different systems of imposing influence. So the Catholic Church and Fox News both have influence, but in very different ways. And I think that should be distinguished.
But both are billion-dollar organizations.
And they function in very different ways. So we can say, well, they're all the same, they have influence, but it's just a confusing way to talk. I think we should distinguish the way the media operate from the way religious institutions operate, from the way public intellectuals operate, and so on. Yes, in some sense, they all have influence, but you might as well say, well, they all breathe.
Well, no, but I think is the core. What I'm getting at is that Wikipedia and Linux and science as an endeavor in general doesn't have influence. There is no one who controls science or physics because there's no profit motive. There's no one telling the scientists what to do. If you don't like what a person's doing, you can go to another university. Linux is the same way. Wikipedia is the same way. You could put it on your computer, use it for whatever you want. So my point being, you can't use Fox News for whatever you want. You can't use the Catholic Church. I'm here using it only in the economic sense. You can't use large privately owned organizations like Twitter to do whatever you want, but you can use open source software on your computer to do whatever you want. So my point is that if you have an organization that's controlled top down, whether it's by the Pope or whether it's by Mark Zuckerberg, then it selects who to promote and who not to promote, what viewpoint to promote, what not. But if you have a bottom up movement of people contributing collaboratively to a growing snowball of software or a growing snowball of knowledge or a growing snowball of science, then that snowball is not owned by anybody, and anyone can go ahead, patents put aside, but anyone could go ahead and use it for whatever purpose. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm trying to say one is unrestricted.
I not only see it, it's totally uncontentious. Yes, of course it's true. It's true by definition. So yes, it's true.
So could we use that same thing for news? I guess that's my main question. Can we use that for delivering the news, and citizen journalists with their phones can record the video instead of having paid journalists to do that?
If you decide to have a news bureau in Karachi with reporters, then you can do it. But you're using the news that comes from the privately owned institutions and from in other countries outside the United States, from public media like BBC.
Okay, so I'll just bring it full circle. We started out talking about electricity being generated in your own home with solar panels. What if 5 years from now, the news, the primary news, is generated by people on the ground filming the attacks?
Who have news bureaus all over the world and reporters reporting to them and so on.
But I just want to be clear, crystal clear in my question. Forget news bureaus. I'm not talking about privately owned organizations.
You lose all information.
What if instead of privately owned organizations, we had citizen journalists or people who just uploaded videos, and then a group like on Wikipedia or others making sense of the videos.
How do the citizen journals find out what's happening in Pakistan?
No, they live in Pakistan. Only the people who are there will record what's actually happening.
The people of the world get together and all of them produce news for each other all over the world.
That's correct.
Yeah.
For example, in Gaza, many reporters were not allowed, but people on the ground can now record it themselves, right?
I'd love to have a world in which people live in peace and harmony and love each other and so on. I don't see much point discussing it.
Well, that's interesting. Anyway, I just basically think that, in my opinion, the world needs an alternative to the capitalist controlled media. What I'm saying is, you know,
you don't have to convince me about that. I've believed it all my life. That's one of the reasons why Ed and I wrote that book.
Fantastic. All right, Noam Chomsky, always a pleasure. Hope to speak to you soon.
Good to
Thank you.
talk to you.